Every morning for 11 years, I ate the emperor's food before he did. That was the job. Whatever arrived at Claudius's table, the bread, the wine, the sauces, the fruit, the dishes of roasted game and the mushrooms he loved above everything else, I tasted first. A small portion, enough to detect, enough that if something was wrong, it would reach me before it reached him. 11 years. I sat at the edge of power and I ate its food, and I kept the most powerful man in the world alive, one meal at a time. And on the night of the 13th of October, in the 54th year after the birth of Christ, I placed a dish of mushrooms in front of the Emperor of Rome. I had already tasted them. I knew what was in them. I served them anyway. This is what I have to tell you, not a poison, not Agrippina, not a physician with his feather and his second chance at murder. All of it that is known, or suspected, or whispered in the corridors of the Palatine Inn by people who were nowhere near that room. What nobody knows is what happened before the mushrooms arrived at the table, what I was asked, what I agreed to, what it cost me to carry both of those things out of that room and live with them for 20 years afterward. I'm telling you now because there's nobody left to protect and nobody left to fear, and because the truth has been sitting in my chest like a stone and I'm tired of the weight of it. My name is Halotus. I was the emperor's food taster, his praegustator, in formal Latin. A eunuch, which in the imperial household meant a man the emperor could trust with proximity, precisely because proximity was the only power available to me. I could not inherit. I could not father sons with ambitions. I could not accumulate the kind of political power that made other men dangerous. I could only be close. And close in a world where men died from what they had was the most valuable thing an emperor could have near him. I came to the imperial household at 14. By the time Claudius became emperor in 41 AD, found hiding behind the curtain in the palace after Caligula's assassination, pulled out by soldiers who declared him emperor because he had agreed to be one. I was already there, already learning the craft of keeping a man alive through careful attention to everything he consumed. Claudius noticed me within the first month, not because I was remarkable, because I was careful in a way he recognized, the way a careful man recognizes carefulness in others as a shared language. He had spent 30 years being underestimated. His family had kept him out of public life as much as possible. The limp was real. The stammer was real. The head that shook when he was anxious was real. But the mind behind all of it was one of the sharpest in Rome. He had spent 30 years hiding it so effectively that even people who should have known better never grasped what they were dealing with. I knew within 6 months. He began talking to me during the meal tastings. First brief exchanges about what I had detected, what I thought about a particular preparation, then longer conversations, then eventually the kind of conversations that happen between people who have decided, without announcing it, that they trust each other. He told me once, late in the evening after a state dinner, that the most useful thing a man could be in Rome was one that nobody thought is worth watching. I understood exactly what he meant. We were, in that specific way, the same kind of person. Agrippina married Claudius in 49 AD. She was his niece. This required a special decree from the Senate. Marriage between an uncle and niece was legal under Roman law. But Agrippina was the kind of woman for whom laws were problems to be solved rather than limits to be observed, and the Senate found reasons to accommodate her. I had watched the women of the imperial household my entire working life. I had watched Messalina, Claudius's third wife, operate with the cold efficiency of a person who viewed other people entirely as instruments. I thought I understood what imperial ambition looked like up close. Agrippina taught me I had only seen performances before. She was beautiful in a way that announced its own purpose, not warmth. A precision, as though every feature had been arranged to produce a specific calculated effect. She moved through rooms the way water moves through a channel, directed, purposeful, never wasted. She spoke to you as though she had decided what the conversation needed to produce before it began, and the conversation produced it. I watched her with Claudius and I watched Claudius with her, and I understood gradually, then all at once, that whatever she was planning, it was not part of the planning. He thought she loved him. He was not a foolish man. In almost everything else, he was the opposite of foolish. But Agrippina was not almost everything else. She had a son from a previous marriage, a boy named Nero. She had already decided, long before she found me, that Nero was going to become the Emperor of Rome. The only question was timing. Claudius had his own son, Britannicus, but Claudius chose his stepson Nero to inherit the empire over his biological son. If Claudius lived long enough to reconsider who should inherit the throne, Agrippina's entire investment was wasted. She could not afford to let Claudius live long enough to reconsider, and she knew exactly who to talk to. The conversation happened 3 weeks before the mushrooms. She found me in the kitchen corridor, not a private meeting, not a formal arrangement. She simply appeared one morning between the kitchen fires and the passage to the triclinium, at the hour when I was moving through the final checks of the day's preparation, and she fell into step beside me, as though this were a routine thing, as though the Empress of Rome regularly walks through the kitchen corridors at dawn. She told me what she needed without preamble. Claudius was going to be given mushrooms at a banquet, his favorite, Caesar's mushrooms, the bright orange Amanita Caesarea that arrived at the Imperial table as a luxury and that Claudius consumed with a pleasure he never bothered to conceal. The mushrooms would be prepared by the kitchen staff in the usual way. They would arrive at the triclinium in the usual sequence. I would take my position beside Claudius, as I always did, and taste from the dish when it reached him. What I was to taste was on the right side of the dish. The left side would be poisoned. My portion would be clean. My expression would confirm it. Claudius would eat. She told me all of this, standing in a palace corridor with kitchen smoke in the air and the sounds of the morning preparation around us, in the same even voice she used for everything, without any attempt to soften or justify it. Then she waited. I stood in that corridor and I thought about what happened to people who said no to Agrippina. I thought about what happened to people who said yes. And then I said yes. I've spent 20 years trying to explain that decision to myself. Some days the explanation is simple and cold. I was a eunuch with no family and no patron powerful enough to stand between me and an empress who had already decided what was going to happen. Refusing would have changed nothing about the outcome. It would only have changed what happened to me. Some days that feels completely true. Some days it feels like the story a coward tells himself. The honest answer is probably both. The evening of the 13th of October began like every other state banquet. I started in the kitchen as I always did, moving through the preparations, tasting dishes as they came off the fire, checking the wine, running the chain of custody from the first ingredient to the final plating that had kept Claudius alive for 11 years. The mushrooms arrived at the kitchen from the market that afternoon. Caesar's mushrooms, bright orange, rare, the luxury of the Roman aristocratic table. They were prepared in a sauce of garum and olive oil with herbs, the smell of it filling the kitchen with the warm earthiness of good mushrooms, properly cooked. Then I walked with the dish through the corridor and into the triclinium where Claudius was already reclining at the head of the table with his guests arranged around him. The room lit with oil lamps, the noise and warmth of a state dinner in full flow. He was in good spirits that evening, laughing at something a guest had said, a genuine laugh, not the performed laughter of a public occasion, the real one, the one that made his head shake and his face open in a way that only happened when something had actually reached him. I took my position beside him. The mushrooms were set on the table. I lifted a portion from the right side of the dish, my portion, the clean portion, and I placed it in my mouth, and I chewed it. and I swallowed it. And I looked at Claudius with the face of a man who has found nothing wrong. He looked at the mushrooms, and his expression shifted the way it always shifted when something he genuinely wanted appeared in front of him. A simple pleasure, uncomplicated. The pleasure of a man who had spent his life navigating a world of concealed intentions and had found it in certain foods, something that required nothing from him. Yet, I stood at the edge of the room and I watched him eat. The symptoms began perhaps an hour later. I knew exactly what I was watching. 11 years of tasting food for poison had made the sequence as familiar to me as the sequence of a meal itself. The reddening of the eyes, the excess saliva, the way the hands begin to shake with a different quality than age or nerves, then the abdominal pain arriving and refusing to leave. His body understood something was wrong before his mind fully grasped it. He tried to vomit, his body attempting to correct itself the way bodies do when they recognize that what is inside them should not be there. The physician Xenophon was called. Xenophon was a Greek doctor who had served Claudius for years, respected, trusted, and, as I had understood in the weeks before that evening, carrying his own instructions from Agrippina on this particular night. He came into the room and produced a feather. The purpose of a feather in medicine was to stimulate vomiting, to clear the throat, to help the body expel what was harming it. Xenophon inserted it gently into the emperor's throat, ostensibly to assist the process Claudius' own body had already begun. The feather was not clean. Claudius died in the early hours of the morning of the 14th of October, 54 AD. He had reigned for 13 years, 8 months, and 20 days. Agrippina announced at dawn that the emperor had passed peacefully in his sleep. Nero was declared emperor before the sun was fully up. And Nero, when told that the man who had been his adoptive father had died, the man who had given him the name and the position that put him on the throne of Rome, said, in the hearing of several people who recorded it afterward, that mushrooms were the food of the gods, because Claudius had become a god through eating them. He was 17 years old. He found it funny. Nobody came for me. Agrippina's protection held through the transition. I remained in the palace, new emperor, same position, same kitchen corridor in the mornings, same walk from the preparation fires to the triclinium, same position beside whoever was eating. Nero had no particular interest in me. I was furniture, I was function. I watched what followed from my position inside the palace, and what followed was this. Agrippina lasted 4 years. She had put Nero on the throne, expecting to control him. What she had not calculated was that the qualities that made Nero useful for her purposes, his vanity, his self-obsession, his complete belief in his own importance, were the same qualities that made him impossible to control. She had created something she could not manage, which is a particular kind of ending available only to people who have spent their lives managing others. By 59 AD, she had become inconvenient to him, more than inconvenient, threatening. She knew too much, she had too much influence, and Nero, raised in a family where murder was a tool of governance, had absorbed that lesson completely. He tried to kill her with a collapsing boat. This sounds like something from a story invented to illustrate a point. It was not. He had a boat built with a mechanism designed to collapse and sink while she was on it. He invited her aboard for a reconciliation dinner and waited. She survived by swimming to the shore. Nero, apparently untroubled by the fact that his mother had just swum away from his assassination attempt, sent soldiers to her villa. They stabbed her. According to the account, as the soldiers raised their weapons, she pointed to her own abdomen, the womb that had borne the son was now having her killed, and told them to strike there. I heard this account and believed it immediately. That was exactly the kind of exit Agrippina would have chosen. She was 43 years old. She had put Nero on the throne of the most powerful empire in the world and died for it 5 years later on his direct order. Xenophon returned to his home highland, of course, after the death of Claudius. He did not stay in Rome. This struck me at the time as the decision of a man who understood that what he had done with that feather was the kind of thing that Rome's shifting political winds might one day make inconvenient to have done. He left before anyone with the authority to ask inconvenient questions was in a position to ask them. He died in course, in his own bed, of courses that had nothing to do with imperial politics. Some people make their choices and walk away from them intact. I have thought about Xenophon many times, about the specific variety of luck that is available to a man who commits the decisive act and then removes himself from the orbit of its consequences. I did not have that option. I was the furniture. I stayed. And then there was Locusta, who I knew only by reputation, and then by what I observed from a distance. She was Rome's professional poisoner, not a secret, not a whisper, but an acknowledged figure who operated with the specific impunity of someone whose skills were too useful to the people in power for those people to pretend they weren't using them. Agrippina had employed her to produce the mushroom poison. After Claudius died and Nero took the throne, Nero kept her on retainer. He used her again almost immediately. Britannicus, Claudius' own son, the legitimate heir who had been displaced when Claudius adopted Nero, died at a dinner party in 55 AD, a day before his 40th birthday. He collapsed mid-meal at the table. Nero, sitting beside him, told the other guests that Britannicus had a tendency to epileptic fits and they should not be alarmed. Nobody was alarmed. Nobody asked questions. Locusta had by that point become something close to an official institution. She trained students, received an imperial estate as payment, operated in full daylight. The most powerful empire in the world had given a professional poisoner a country estate and a faculty position. After Nero was eventually overthrown and killed in 68 AD, having managed in 14 years to become so comprehensively despised that the Senate declared him a public enemy and the army abandoned him, and he ended his own life in a freedman's house outside the city, reportedly having to be helped through it because he couldn't bring himself to do it cleanly. After all of that, Locusta's protection ended with him. The new emperor, Galba, had her paraded through the city and executed. She had survived by being useful. She died the moment she wasn't. Nero's own hand deserves more than a sentence because it was, in its specific details, the hand of a man who had been handed everything and destroyed all of it with the specific thoroughness available only to people who believe themselves exempt from consequences. He had killed his mother. He had killed his first wife, Octavia, had her executed and sent her head to his mistress, Poppy, as a gift, which is the kind of detail that resists being absorbed and simply has to be acknowledged and moved past. He had kicked Poppy to death while she was pregnant. He had burned the large sections of Rome and blamed the Christians. He had executed senators, philosophers, poets, anyone whose existence made him feel insufficient by comparison. By 68 AD, the legions had had enough. Governors began declaring against him. The Praetorian Guard, the same institution that had pulled a trembling Claudius out behind the curtain and made him an emperor, withdrew their support. Nero fled the city with 4 servants. He ended up in a freedman's villa outside Rome, hiding in a reed bed while his pursuers closed in, and he could not do what was necessary without help. He wept. He kept saying it was too late. He kept saying what an artist was dying with him, as though he's singing with the loss the world should be mourning. His secretary had to guide his hand. He was 30 years old. The boy who had laughed about mushrooms being the food of the gods, who had found it funny that the man who raised him had been poisoned to make way for him, died with a borrowed hand on the knife. I heard this and I felt something I cannot cleanly name. Not satisfaction, not justice, something quieter than either. The specific settling that happens when a thing that has been unresolved for a very long time reaches its resolution, even if the resolution comes too late to help anyone who should have helped. I am still here, still tasting food, The emperors have come and gone with a speed that makes the long stability of Claudius' 13 years seem like a different world entirely. 4 emperors in a single year after Nero, then the Flavian dynasty settling things down. Vespasian, running a more competent operation than anyone in the Julio-Claudian line had managed since Augustus. I taste their food, I sit at the same table, and in the mornings, before the kitchen slaves arrive with the day's first dishes, I think about Claudius, the laugh that made his head shake, the conversations late at night when the palace was quiet, the mushrooms arriving in their dish, smelling of garlic and olive oil, the portion on the left side, clean, my hands reaching for it. He trusted me with the thing he was most afraid of, and I sat at a table and took from the left side and told him it was safe. He ate, and I watched. Claudius was declared a god after his death. The Senate voted it. The ceremonies were performed. The man who had been hidden behind the curtain in terror, who had been called a monster by his own grandmother, who had built an empire and reformed its laws, while everyone assumed he was too broken to manage himself, declared divine. Nero made jokes about it until he died, and the god they made of Claudius has outlasted everyone in that room, everyone except me. My name is Halotus.